June 6th, 1944, 6:30 hours, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The world exploded before the ramp even touched the water. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical wall of sound that shattered your teeth. Crack dwack, crack dwack. That was the MG-42s, the Hitler's buzzsaw, tearing through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. The moment the steel gate dropped, a sheet of lead swept into the Higgins boat, turning the interior into a screaming metal box of shredded flesh. The man directly in front of me was decapitated instantly. His blood sprayed hot and salty across my goggles before his body even hit the deck. I dived into the water. It was freezing, a bitter, bone-chilling cold that gripped my lungs. But the water wasn't blue. It was a thick, frothy crimson. Wham! An 88mm artillery shell impacted 10 yards to my left, sending a geyser of mud, seawater, and human limbs 50 feet into the gray sky. The concussive force felt like a sledgehammer to my chest, blowing the air out of my lungs until I thought my ribs would snap. Under the surface, I could hear the muffled ping, ping, ping of bullets zipping through the water, seeking out anyone trying to swim for the shore. I scrambled onto the wet sand, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. The sulfurous stench of cordite, the oily tang of burning diesel, and the overwhelming metallic copper smell of fresh blood. Boom! Another shell rocked the earth. The ground didn't just shake, it heaved. I crawled behind a Czech hedgehog, a jagged steel tank trap, but it offered no soul-deep comfort. All around me, the beach was a symphony of destruction. Whiz, zip, thud. Bullets were punching into the sand, into the packs of the dead, into the bodies of the living. Medic! Medic! The screams were everywhere, piercing through the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the mortars. I looked up and saw a boy from my company, no older than 19, staggering blindly through the surf. His jaw was gone. He wasn't screaming. He was just making a horrific, gurgling sound as he clutched at the air. Before I could move, a burst of machine gun fire stitched across his torso, throwing him backward into the rising tide like a rag doll. The bunkers on the bluffs were spitting continuous tongues of flame. You couldn't see the Germans. You could only see the white-hot flashes of their muzzles. Kaboom! A direct hit on a landing craft nearby turned it into a roaring funeral pyre. Men were jumping into the water covered in burning oil, their screams lost in the roar of the Atlantic. The shoreline was becoming a junkyard of souls. Discarded gas masks, waterlogged rucksacks, and helmets lay scattered among the bodies. I felt the grit of the sand between my teeth, sand mixed with the gray ash of explosions. Every time I tried to move, the MG-42s would sow a line of dust just inches from my boots. There was no front line. There was only a kill zone. I saw a sergeant trying to rally his men, screaming over the roar of the screaming Mimi's rockets. Ree-bang! But his voice was swallowed by the thunder. A mortar round landed directly in his squad's huddle. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a smoking crater and the smell of burnt wool and scorched earth. The tide was coming in fast, pushing the dead up against us, forcing us closer to the base of the cliffs where the mines were waiting. The water hissed as it touched the hot shrapnel littering the beach. We were pinned down, paralyzed by a storm of steel that never stopped, never breathed, and never showed mercy. This wasn't a battle. It was a mechanical harvest. The air was so thick with lead, you felt like you could grab it. I pressed my face into the wet, blood-soaked sand and realized that on this day, at this hour, Omaha Beach was the loudest, most violent place in the history of the world. June 6th, 1944, 7:15 hours. The Shingle, Omaha Beach. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a cold, mechanical desperation. I was no longer a human being. I was a triage machine operating in a slaughterhouse. My medical bag felt like it was filled with lead, and my hands were so slick with blood and seawater that I could barely grip my trauma shears. "Medic, help me!" The cries were coming from every direction, a haunting choir of agony that rose above the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the German mortars. I crawled on my belly, dragging my kit through the red slush, my eyes darting across the carnage, looking for a sign of life, any sign of life that I could actually sustain. This was the life or death choice. This was the moment they didn't prepare you for in training. In the textbooks, you treat everyone. On Omaha, you play God. I reached the first man, a private, barely 18. His legs were mangled by a bouncing Betty mine. His femoral artery was pumping bright, rhythmic jets of crimson into the sand. I looked into his eyes. They were wide, dilated, and full of a terrifying clarity. He knew. I reached for a tourniquet, my mind racing. But then I looked past him. 3 yards away, another boy was clutching his throat, air whistling through a jagged hole in his windpipe. Behind him, 2 more were screaming, their bodies peppered with shrapnel, but their vital organs intact. I looked back at the private with the ruined legs. He was losing too much, too fast. If I stayed to fix him, the other 3 would bleed out. If I stayed, I would use all my morphine and all my bandages on a man who would likely die before he reached a hospital ship. My heart turned to stone. I leaned in close to his ear, whispering over the deafening roar of an 88mm shell impact. "Hang on, son. I'll be right back." It was a lie. We both knew it was a lie. I pressed a single syringe of morphine into his arm, a mercy shot, and I turned my back on him. I had to leave him to the rising tide. I had to choose who had the best chance to keep fighting, or at least the best chance to see tomorrow. The work was brutal and primitive. I was kneeling in a crater, the sand collapsing around me every time a shell landed. Vree-bam! The concussive force sprayed dirt into the open abdominal wound of the man I was trying to patch. I didn't have time to be sterile. I scooped out the sand with my bare fingers, shoving gauze into the cavity, screaming at the top of my lungs for him to stay with me. "Look at me, Mac. Don't you dare close your eyes. Look at me." His blood was hot, steaming in the cool morning air, coating my sleeves up to the elbows. The shortage of supplies was a nightmare. I was running out of sulfur powder. I was down to my last few rolls of heavy bandages. I began stripping the kits off the dead, those who no longer needed them. I crawled from body to body, reaching into the webbing of men who were already cold, stealing their morphine, their bandages, their life-saving tools to give to the man 5 feet away who was still shivering. It felt like grave robbing, but the living were screaming louder than the ghosts. Every decision was a heavy blow to the soul. I found the lieutenant with his chest blown open, the sucking chest wound making a horrific whistling sound with every gasp. I had one occlusive dressing left. One. As I reached for it, a mortar blast nearby sent a spray of shrapnel into a group of 3 soldiers huddling behind a steel hedgehog. They were all hit. They were all screaming. I looked at the lieutenant. His eyes were already rolling back. The light was fading. I took that dressing and I ran to the 3 men. I had to gamble. I had to put the resources where they would do the most good. I gave the lieutenant a prayer and gave the others the gauze. The physical exertion was soul-crushing. My muscles were screaming, my lungs burned from the smoke and the salt, and my knees were raw from dragging myself across the abrasive sand and jagged shrapnel. There was no water to drink, only the bitter taste of adrenaline and the copper of blood. I watched a fellow medic, a man I'd trained with in England, get hit by a sniper round while he was plasma drilling a casualty. He slumped over his patient, 2 more lives gone in a heartbeat. I didn't cry. I didn't have time to cry. I just grabbed his bag and kept moving. I remember one boy. He couldn't have been older than 17. He was holding his own intestines in his hands, staring at them with a look of utter confusion, as if he were looking at a broken toy. He wasn't crying. He just looked at me and asked, "Is it bad, Doc?" I looked at the massive trauma, the sand basted into his vitals, the gray color already taking over his face. I knew he was a black tag, expectant, non-salvageable. I squeezed his hand, gave him the last of my water, and patted his shoulder. "You're doing great, kid. Just rest. Just close your eyes for a minute." I moved to the next man. That silence, the silence of the men you leave behind, is louder than any artillery barrage. The triage was a curse. Every time I moved past a man who was too far gone to save, I felt a piece of my own humanity stay behind with him in the sand. We were fighting a war against the clock, against the tide, and against an enemy that didn't stop firing just because we were wearing Red Cross armbands. In fact, the Red Crosses felt like bullseyes. Under that rain of fire, under that Mua bomb, I wasn't just a doctor. I was a judge, an executioner, and a savior all at once. And the weight of it was crushing the life out of me. We were drowning in a sea of broken men, and I was trying to bail out the ocean with a tin cup. There was no glory in that middle hour on Omaha. There was only the wet, sticky reality of 1,000 no's for every yes I could give to a dying man. I kept moving, kept stabbing morphine, kept tying tourniquets, until I couldn't remember my own name, only the faces of the ones I had to leave behind in the red surf. June 6th, 1944. 1,400 hours. The seawall, Omaha Beach. Time had lost all meaning. I didn't know if we had been on this strip of hell for an hour or a lifetime. The initial adrenaline, that sharp electric jolt that makes you run faster than you ever thought possible, was gone. It had drained out of me, leaving behind a hollow, aching void filled with lead. Every movement was a negotiation with gravity. My uniform, the heavy wool serge, was soaked through with seawater, sweat, and the blood of men I couldn't save. It clung to my skin like a freezing second skin, weighing me down. My boots were full of water and grit, rubbing the skin off my heels with every step. I felt like I was dragging a corpse, only to realize the corpse was my own body. We were huddled against the shrapnel-scarred seawall, the only thing separating us from the slaughter behind us and the uncertain death on the bluffs ahead. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual crushing. I looked at the men around me, the liberators of Europe. They didn't look like heroes. They looked like ghosts. They were shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold Atlantic wind whipping off the channel, but from the shock. Their hands shook so violently, they couldn't even light the damp cigarettes they fished out of their waterproof bags. I tried to light one for a corporal next to me, but my own hands were trembling just as bad. We just stared at each other. Two broken men, sharing a flame that wouldn't catch, communicating a lifetime of misery without saying a word. The thirst was a torture I hadn't expected. You'd think with the ocean crashing at your feet, you wouldn't think of water. But the salt spray just crusted our lips and stung our tongues. My canteen had been shot through hours ago, a stray bullet that drained my water supply into the sand. My throat felt like it was stuffed with cotton and broken glass. Every time I breathed, I inhaled the thick, acrid smoke of burning tanks and the sickeningly sweet smell of death that was beginning to rise under the afternoon sun. I saw men trying to drink from muddy puddles formed in shell craters, only to retch because the water was mixed with cordite and oil. We were starving, but the thought of opening a K-ration made our stomachs turn. The smell of the ham and eggs cans mixed with the stench of the dead was enough to make you vomit dry bile. The noise had done something to our heads. The constant thundering roar of the naval bombardment and the screech of the rockets had left us half deaf. I was shouting at a sergeant 3 feet away, and he was just staring at my moving lips, his eyes glazed over with that 1,000-yard stare. We were isolated in a crowd. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a bubble of ringing silence where the only things that penetrated were the vibrations of the explosions through the ground. I saw a radio operator weeping over his smashed equipment, screaming into a dead handset, begging for someone, anyone, to tell him we weren't forgotten. But the radio was just static, hiss, and the void. Moving forward was an exercise in horror. To advance, we had to crawl. And to crawl, we had to crawl over them. The beach was so cluttered with the fallen that you couldn't find a patch of clear sand. I had to drag my body over the chests and legs of boys from the 116th, looking into their unseeing eyes as I used their gear for cover. It felt like a desecration. I wanted to apologize to every one of them. Sorry, buddy. I'm sorry. I kept whispering it until it became a meaningless mantra. The sand was abrasive, grinding into my knees and elbows, wearing the skin raw. My uniform was torn, my knees were bleeding, and the sand had worked its way into the wounds, stinging like fire. The sheer weight of the gear was breaking us. The infantrymen were carrying 80 pounds of equipment, ammo, mortars, rations, shovels. After hours of fighting in water and wet sand, that 80 pounds felt like 800. I saw men simply collapse, not because they were shot, but because their muscles just quit. They lay face down in the dirt, gasping for air, unable to lift their rifles. I checked the kid who had fallen. He wasn't hit. He was just done. His body had nothing left to give. He looked at me with tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face and whispered, I just can't stand up again, Doc. I didn't have the heart to yell at him. I barely had the strength to stand up myself. And then there was the smell. It's the one thing the newsreels can't show you. By the afternoon, The smell of the battlefield had ripened. It was a mixture of wet wool, diesel fuel, high explosives, and the metallic copper scent of massive blood loss. But underneath that was the smell of fear, sweat, urine, and feces. When the ramps dropped, bowels released. It was the raw, primal scent of terror. It coated the back of your throat. You couldn't spit it out. It became a part of you. I looked up at the bluffs. We had taken the beach, technically, but at what cost? The sand behind us was a carpet of khaki and red. The waves were still washing in, gently rocking the bodies of the men who never made it past the water's edge. I felt a profound, crushing guilt for being alive. Why was my chest rising and falling when the man next to me, who had shown me a picture of his sweetheart just yesterday, was lying face down in the surf? Survival didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a clerical error. It felt like a burden. We were exhausted beyond the capacity of human language to describe. My bones felt brittle, my eyes burned, and my mind was fracturing. I was a doctor, a healer, but I felt like a gravedigger. We began the slow, painful climb up the draw, leaving the beach behind. But we all knew we would never really leave it. A part of us would stay on that sand forever, frozen in the cold water, pinned down by the machine guns. I adjusted the strap of my medical bag, lighter now, empty of morphine, empty of hope, and forced one foot in front of the other. We were the lucky ones. We were the living. But God help us, we felt dead inside.